Hi, thanks for taking the time to watch our presentation. I'm Dan Hickey. I'm a professor with the Indiana University Learning Sciences program. This presentation is with Morgan Lowe. She's a PhD student in the same program. This presentation was delivered at the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning Conference in French Lick, Indiana on October 31st, 2024. I want to acknowledge the current members of my research lab, and this includes, of course, Morgan, but also Grant Chartrand, who is also presenting at this conference in the following day. Big thanks to Stacy Maroney. When she was the Vice President for Information Technology, she provided several internal grants that really helped lay the groundwork for some of what we'll be talking about today. She's currently the Interim Dean of the School of Ed. Thanks also to Google, who in 2014 funded us to do what we call the Big Open Online course, where we learned other insights that I'll be sharing today. So I'm here today to talk about transfer. Transfer doesn't really come up that much in the SOTL literature. My search uncovered some relatively obscure references. This analysis by Manarin and others. Now, what I want to point out here is that if you look at what was measured, they say conventional learning outcomes. Well, this is important because I'm primarily an assessment and a transfer scholar, and assessment is really a proxy for transfer. So in fact, there you see that the largest number of studies in their bibliometric analysis did look at transfer. They just didn't call it that. They called it conventional learning outcomes. This is almost always some form of an assessment, which serve as proxies for transfer to future professional educational settings. One thing that I'm not speaking about today is transfer in terms of transfer of credits. This is very common in higher education, and quite often transfer of learning gets conflated with transfer of credits. Of course, transfer is huge in cognitive psych, ed psych, and learning sciences. We see there on the left, from the very dawn of the cognitive revolution, was this tension between the transfer of higher order conceptual schema and transfer of more specific cognitive skills in Anderson's work. In ed psych, you see these distinctions between sort of high road and low road transfer in Perkins and Solomon. The problem-solving transfer chapter by Mayer and Whitrock was very influential when they talked about metacognitive transfer of general and specific skills. Bransford's notion of preparation for future learning was very, very influential. In the learning sciences over there on the right, we see this fairly pragmatic embrace of different kinds of transfer. I've written about comparing the different forms of transfer, and in particular the work of Lobato, and especially Randy Engel, that I'll be talking about a lot today. Of course, authenticity is huge in SOTL and in professional education. It's probably right up there with active learning as something that's just talked about constantly. We see in the very first issue of the iSOTL journal, literally the very first one, Krieger talks about the scholarship of teaching and learning as authentic practice. Also in that first year, Oraquo's influential article talked about authenticity. Lots of other discussions about authenticity by leading scholars over the years. And then this one is particularly important. Bozelek has written quite a bit about authentic learning, and I want to point to this one because of the last author, Jan Harrington. Harrington has written extensively about authentic learning, primarily within the instructional systems technology and e-learning communities, but also that book with Bozelek. So this is a very big deal, right? There's lots of sessions here today. People will be talking about authentic learning. Today we'll be talking about a very different vision of authenticity than many of you are probably thinking about. This is a very important report, this consensus study report. These are reports where they bring together groups of acknowledged experts and follow a very, very careful process to reach consensus on issues of national importance. And in this case, it's about broadening interest and competency in computing in particular, getting more young people, diverse young people, minoritized young people into computing ed. And it included a bunch of authors, but in particular, these three scholars, Victor Lee, past president of my primary association, Learning Sciences, Mimi Ito, just an amazing scholar who sponsored a decade of work of mine at the MacArthur Foundation, and Barbara Means, who is currently at Digital Promise. And they distinguished between professional and personal authenticity. Now, they acknowledge that professional authenticity is much more common. We see this in problem-based learning. We certainly see this in the SOLO community. They argued quite strongly that professional authentic environments usually reflect mainstream perspectives, often white male role models and viewpoints. And they argue forcefully that because of that, professionally authentic environments can be alien and unwelcoming for females and minoritized students. And they called for drawing more on culturally relevant, culturally sustaining, asset-based pedagogies if we want to broaden interest and competency in computing. And they argued, I believe this is more reflects the consensus point. They didn't really take a stand on it, but they said that the tension between these two kinds of authenticity are the result of placing them on a single continuum, when in fact they're points on two continua. Now, they did not address how to integrate professional and personal authenticity, but they did call for more research, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. The ideas at the core of my work really follow quite directly from the late Randy Engel. Starting around 2005, I began taking up her notions of PDE, productive disciplinary engagement, and in particular in my redesigning online courses when I started teaching online in 2008. The 4PD, so this is a framework for understanding engagement, but it's also a set of design principles for fostering engagement. And this reflects a unique way that the learning sciences are structured, that you can do one and the same with both of those things. You can have a framework for understanding something and design principles for fostering something. So the four principles, the first and foremost, you problematize content from each student's own perspective, right? So this is very consistent with personal authenticity. Now, once that happens, you want to give students the authority to solve the problems that emerge when they problematize course content from their own perspective. You want to hold students accountable to whatever discipline they're learning in and to their peers. And you want to provide them with the resources needed to accomplish these things. So we've been arguing now for about 5 years that Engel's work in PDE are consistent with culturally sustaining pedagogy, and now we're arguing that they're consistent with personal authenticity as well. Subsequently, Engel moved her work on engagement into transfer. So this is a work that is very rooted in situative learning theories. In 2006, she reanalyzed the data from 2002 and gave forth this idea of expansive framing. And then in 2012, published really a landmark paper that outlined a set of design principles for fostering engagement that leads to strong transfer, knowledge that transfers readily and widely. You want to push students to make connections with outside personally relevant people, places, topics, and times. You want to help students position themselves as authors who are contributing to a larger conversation over space and time. And what you're really aiming for is to establish a state that curriculum theorists call intercontextuality. For those of you who are experienced writers, you know the state when you're imagining your audience, and you really, as you write over your career, there's really a broader conversation that's happening, and it's an ambitious goal, but you know how you feel when you really get into that flow state when you're writing and you're imagining your audience and you're really using writing to extend your brain and make sense of complex stuff. Well, if you can get students to do that even just a little during class, the knowledge that they gain when they're authoring new insights at the intersection of their interests and that content is much, much more likely to transfer in the future. The 2012 piece offered 5 very compelling explanations for why expansive framing supports transfer. I'll get back to those if we have time at the end. They're pretty complicated. However, this is consistent with culturally sustaining pedagogy and personal authenticity. So since around 2008, I've been advancing this framework that I've been calling participatory learning and assessment. I essentially embedded PDE and expansive framing within a situative, multi-level assessment model that came out of the kind of the first half of my career. And this means aligning learning across increasingly formal levels of formative and summative assessments. So there's 4, sometimes 5 design principles, primarily in online education. Again, the first one really embraces all of Engel's principles. The second one is having students reflect on their engagement. The third one is have formative self-assessments that represent course content semi-formally. And then the fourth one is just have time-limited multiple choice summative exams, typically 3 and 4 done automatically in a learning management system, really freeing up almost all of my time in my online courses to focus on that very first one. So we've published, I don't know, 5 or 6 articles about this. It's been taken up some, but certainly not as widely as we had hoped. I think the issue is that situative theory really is quite complex. And some of the elements, of particularly this personal problematization, this personally authentic, really does diverge from more constructivist approaches like anchored instruction and problem-based learning. Now, it does require individualized instructor engagement with each of those sort of personally problematized contexts. Now, there's some research out there that's showing how difficult that is. I think it's a worthy goal, and I'm continuing to pursue it across my work as my collaborators and graduate students. We believe that reframing it as personal authenticity is a promising way to go. And that's why we're here today and tomorrow to sort of begin making the case for this approach that we've reframed as personal authenticity. So let me show you 2 examples of what that looks like in classes. Start with our Learning Theories for Teachers course. This is an undergraduate teacher ed course that I supervise that Morgan is currently teaching. And so it's a pretty standard. We learn core learning theories as they apply to teaching and learning. Many of these students are sophomores. They already pretty easily and readily reflect on their own experience in high school. It's quite common for students to reference their high school experience. Now, we had proposed a study that we were hoping to do before this conference, and that is discussed in the conference program. However, it was really disrupted by 2 pretty massive things that happened. One is that we lost an early field experience in schools because it was just too complicated. That's been replaced with an independent video analysis where the students do a 1-credit course where they do 5 fairly sophisticated video analyses across the semester where they use theory and apply it. I'll return to that. The other one is the external accreditors. They really came down on us pretty hard for relying on the end of their program teacher performance assessment and insisted that we had embedded signature assessments in our courses to show evidence of the trajectory of learning of the students. Ultimately, as I'll show you, this will make for a much better study. We're just initiating this study now because we really had to focus on these other things for the first half. What this means is in the second half of Morgan's course, starting really next week, we're both going to manipulate the workshops, these 5 workshops that students complete. Now we can manipulate the video as well, and then we can examine transfer on a final exam that is quite similar to the video analysis. So let me briefly show you what that looks like. Students choose a clip. We give them access to online videos of actual teacher practice, and then so they first describe this clip, what's going on in this video. This is very common in teacher education and other professional education settings, such as counseling, and really a lot. This strategy scales out to quite a few professional education settings. First, they do a relatively objective theoretical analysis where they take the theories that they've learned about for the particular um, theory, in this case it's social cognitive theory, and they describe what's happening in that clip through the lens. Then they do a practical evaluation where they describe what these instructors are doing more critically. It's a subjective analysis, and then they make suggestions based on those theories. So this is how we're enacting the distinction between expansive framing and a more conventional reflection, right? So we have to make sure that we're not sort of giving them extra work in the expansive framing condition. So that first one, that critical reflection, is the comparison condition. That's a really fair comparison. This is an inward-looking, more constructivist reflection on your learning process, your emotions, and your growth. The personal reflection, this is pretty standard. Expansive framing, how does what you learn relate to your prior experience? How does it relate to your current life outside of this class? And how will you use it in the future? Now, the reflection happens at the end of this activity, but we would expect this reflection to actually be fairly powerful. One is that it gets scored, right? So this is the rubric that it's scored with. So we think students will take it seriously. It also happens twice in the video analysis, and then there will be a similar reflection across 2 workshops. So there will be 4 opportunities to sort of do these 2 different kinds of reflection, and we hope to gather some compelling initial evidence about the impact in terms of transfer as captured in the final exam, the video analysis in the final exam. So let me move on to another example, P540, Learning and Cognition in Education. This is a course that I've been teaching since 1996. I've been teaching it online since about 2008. It's really sort of a bread and butter core course for all of the graduate students in the School of Education. It covers the assumptions about knowing and learning and teaching and how those are sort of linked together within different broader epistemologies, and then their implications for equity, instruction, motivation, and assessment. The first half we go over cognitive theories, and the second half we go over sociocultural theories. And the way that personally authentic learning happens here is the students, they first design a personally relevant instructional goal and context, and then they use that context to engage with the readings each week. And now the work happens in public to the class in a Canvas discussion header. All of the interaction occurs in threaded comments directly on the student work, and because of these the way that I use the reflections to grade the work, and then there's formative self-assessments and a time-limited multiple choice exam at the end, I basically spend almost like 90–95% of my time in class engaging in this very personal, sort of expansively framed work directly on student work. So I'm going to focus on one student, Ty. He's working with us on actually a paper based on this experience. Ty's in the online Ed.D program. He's a director of customer care for Toro lawnmower manufacturer, and he's responsible for training, and he's very sensitive to the costs of training and the return on investment. And so I'm going to use some of Ty's work here. I've redone a couple of his examples, but he did do this work using these examples in class. I've redone a couple of them to illustrate a couple of additional features. So we're literally just, this is work that's happening right now. This was last week. So the very first assignment has these students draft this initial learning outcome. And it reminds them, you're going to be using this. It needs to be relevant to you because you're going to use this to problematize the ideas of the reading each week. And then summarize the context in which this work does or might happen. And so part of that first assignment is that they read a challenging handbook chapter that talks about the sort of the 3 widely recognized different sort of theories of learning: empiricism, rationalism, and sociocultural theory, and has them identify, here's your learning outcome. What do you think is the most relevant? So again, you're seeing this using this personal case to problematize which is the most relevant of these three meta theories, given your goal and context. And this is this resource ranking routine that I use quite a bit, where I have students rank either actual resources or elements of those resources. And then what are the relevant big ideas? Like figure out what are the big ideas in this reading and which one do you think is most important to you and why? So that's a pretty sophisticated insight, the relationship between these three theories. So you can see that this is this really personally authentic, expansively framed engagement that I've been chasing really for the past decade. Since we wrote our proposal for this session, and now we've really gotten quite enamored with the potential of the synergy between personal authenticity and generative AI. It turns out that GPT-4 is just amazingly capable of helping contextualize course resources. So uh, if you have to first check and see whether your platform that you're using knows what you want to teach it, or you just feed it, or you just upload the article, and this is what often happens. I teach them to just upload. So have them first engage in this way without GAI, have them identify, which are the most relevant theories of learning, motivation that we read about this week, and rank them in order of relevance, or at least identify the most and the least relevant, and then apply them to your context. And after they do that, then you can compare the results with GAI. And then what's really quite remarkable is how effectively these platforms, especially OpenAI that I work with mostly on ChatGPT, is it formatively assessing learning in that personally authentic context. Then you can say, okay, now test me out of context in general. Let me show you what that looks like. This engagement prompt, this is part, I'm working on this actual module as part of an online course for all students, and I'm piloting them in this course. And so this is, Ty did this previously. I modified it a little bit to work with this template. But so I've uploaded a handbook chapter that talks about the 6 major cognitive theories of motivation, and says, explain them in order that you think is most relevant to me, and explain why the first ones are most relevant and the last one is least relevant. Again, this is this resource ranking activity that really forces students to think hard about the relative relevance for them personally. This is what I mean by authoring new knowledge. That's something that only the student can come up with. And in this case, ChatGPT can come up with, and they can compare those different rankings and see what insights are there. So here's what we got. This is what ChatGPT did. It identified, and I think it was consistent with Ty's work, that social cognitive theory was the most relevant theory because it focuses on self-efficacy. Then it goes in and it actually does a pretty good job of unpacking the key features of social cognitive theory as they relate to this case to training electronic technicians, and gives an application to provide real world examples of problem solving and feedback. That's a pretty good summary. And this is what really has been mind blowing about ChatGPT 4.0 is it's actually remarkably capable of, of choosing why something's least relevant. Attribution theory, it's more about managing reactions to outcomes than proactively designing courses. But it can always find some connection with each student's context. And this is tremendously valuable, I think, for creating learning environments and fostering learning that is likely to transfer readily and widely. Notice there it says, let me know if you'd like more details. And so you can just prompt to say, that's great, say more. And if you ask it, it'll give you a whole paper section on making this application, that this case that the students can just pull and lift and further refine in their class term paper. This is what I mean by this formative assessment in this personally authentic context. You just say, give me 5 open-ended items. Quiz me on this content in this context. How can you apply self-efficacy to learning experience of service technicians? And in this case, I gave it a good answer. The instructions should gradually become more difficult. And it says, great answer, right? That's a pretty solid answer. That's directly from its recommendations. Now, what's been interesting, I've played around with, is what happens when you get them wrong. So what happens if you get them blatantly wrong? Does it say you're wrong? Well, no, it says give them a hard test there for the second question. While challenging tests can assess learning and build confidence, emphasizing utility value, so it doesn't really come out and say you're really wrong. It's kind of a very gentle tutor in this regard. So again, this learning is happening in this context. Now the next question is, many people argue, especially cognitive theorists argue, that when knowledge is this situated, that it might not transfer to other very different settings. And this is the kind of thing that a conventional multiple choice items can be pretty good, because they have to transfer it to this very decontextualized setting. Now, as long as they haven't been trained in these actual items and the items are hard enough, a lot of people denigrate multiple choice items, but in fact, what they're really denigrating is lousy multiple choice items that you don't really have to deeply understand the content to recognize them. Professional item writers write so-called best answer items, where more than one item answer appears plausible to the less knowledgeable student. Now, this first question, vicarious experiences, if you read anything about social cognitive theory, you know that the answer is B, and that the other ones are really not very good answers. So instead of answering it, I just say, hey, make them harder. Indeed, you can see these are much harder. Notice they're longer, they're more detailed, and some of the answers appear much more plausible. So there you see the first one, I got it correct, and it says, it basically reiterates why it's correct. And the second one, I got it wrong, and again, it says not quite. So again, it clarifies why it's correct, and it further explains the answer. I'm not sure that I'm going to present this. I'm not sure if I'll have time or if the audience is ready for it. But anyways, I'll go ahead and cover this for you. In the 2012 Engel et al. 2012 paper, Engel and colleagues lay out 5 really compelling theoretical explanations of why transfer should be enhanced with expansive framing. And what we're doing in our work is extending this to both personal authenticity and to culturally relevant education. The first one is that if you're imagining the future usefulness, how you're going to use what you're learning, that's going to lead you to use more active and effective learning strategies. You're not just going through the motions for class. The learners might generalize, they might generate examples, self-regulate if you're successful at this. Number 2, when you're in those future transfer opportunities, if you were imagining and even discussing opportunities for transfer, you're going to be more likely to recognize the relevance of your prior learning and transfer. And this is especially the case. So if we take our teacher ed situation, well, if the students were actually discussing together how they might use what they're learning about learning theory in the I-251 course, and those same students are together in a methods class, which is very likely, they're going to be able to discuss and reach a consensus about those prior experiences. And there's going to be something really important that happens, because they're going to know what each other knows about those prior things. They're much, much more likely then to transfer it in. That's like, remember in learning theories class when we learned this, right? So you have to think about transfer not just in the individual sense, but in the social sense. And this is why Engel's work on transfer is so important, because she not only talks about transferring in the content from prior experiences, the social context around that content, both in terms of transfer in as well as transfer in. Both of those things can enhance transfer. Third, students will come to view their prior knowledge and experience as being relevant when they see that they're transferring in their prior experience, and their classmates recognize that those are really good examples in context, and so they transfer in more. And we know that that transfer in prior knowledge is really crucial for learning to learn in a way that's going to indeed transfer out. Fourth, students are recognized as authors of new content. So when these students in I-251, if they've successfully framed their learning of these learning theories around their lives, their past, present, and future settings, they're going to have a sense of ownership over that new knowledge, and they're going to be much more likely to author insights with that knowledge in their future settings, right? Because they feel more confident about it, and because they author that knowledge, they have a strong feel of it. Then the fifth one is really the generalization of the fourth one. If students expansively frame all of their learning across all of their teacher ed courses in a semester, that's going to leave them with a lot of confidence about authoring knowledge more generally that should generalize to other content that wasn't framed expansively. This is particularly important for minoritized students. We know from the research that many minoritized experiences have had this experience of being marginalized by deficit-minded teachers and peers who just don't think that their non-dominant, non-mainstream experiences are relevant to their learning. And so we think that this could really make a big difference for the confidence and really for the learning and the academic success for really all students, but in particular for students who have historically faced discrimination and marginalization by dominant communities. So as you can see, we've had this pretty long-running and multi-site program of research around transfer via expansive framing and now personal authenticity and culturally relevant education. Give you an idea of what is happening here. So we're currently conducting multiple systematic reviews of PDE and expansive framing. After quite a bit of work, identified about 200 peer-reviewed studies that have engaged substantively with these constructs. This includes, we're doing one analysis of PDE, another one of expansive framing. Then we have a review of about 30 that are in culturally relevant education in these constructs. That's in a second round of revision. It's just going back into the journal Educational Psychologist. We have another one going forward with about 30 that are in teacher ed and another that's just getting underway in physics ed with about 30 studies. Quite a bit of work in STEM in physics using these constructs. So Engel et al. In 2012, they summarized 3 research designs. This is basically, Engel knew that she was dying, it turns out, of pancreatic cancer, really sort of leaving behind her legacy for others to take up. She really laid out a comprehensive program of research that we're really hoping to sort of take the lead on advancing. She mentioned 3 research designs, in particular comparative classroom studies and quasi-experimental studies. There really are too few of such studies, especially experimental studies, needed to convince skeptics. Most of the studies that have effect sizes are really, there's just a few of them, and they all have some pretty fundamental confounds. So anyways, we're hoping to change that. One of the ways we'll change that, we've validated an 18-item survey of 6 elements of expansive framing. Several years back, we administered this to 6,000 test takers in the National Survey of Student Engagement as an experimental items. And then Trip Harris is completing his dissertation. He's administered the survey to 200 teacher ed students alongside a survey of asset-based pedagogy and with interviews. That's in progress. So now you've seen we have this good comparison condition with this critical reflection. We think that's going to be crucial for doing a really compelling comparison studies of expansive framing. In the meantime, I'm sort of considering a systematic review of the probably about 30 studies that take up PD and expansive framing in the SOTL and the higher ed community for one of the SOTL journals. Well, thank you for watching our presentation. We hope you found it helpful. If you want more information, we run a blog in my lab called Remediating Assessment. If you just Google that with Blogspot, you'll find it. One of the things that we do with this is give people who might not have access to some of the journals, to the paywall journals where we publish most of our work, is copies of that. You can download them from one of those pages, and it's right there, bit.ly/assessment RMA, assessment remediating assessment. So there's about a dozen articles there you can download. And certainly, we'd love to hear from you. There's our email addresses, and thanks again for watching. Bye-bye.